Hey guys, today we'll be animating the flight deck temp dial on the air conditioning sub panel and flight gear using XML and a little bit of Blender. So let's get started here. So first thing I do, if I were to start this from the ground up, which I did, is that I would look up this knob in Blender to figure out its object name. And then I'll go to the XML file for the overhead panel and start coding it. So let's go into Blender here. And this is what Blender looks like when you first open it. So click out of that and then delete all this stuff. And then we want to import the overhead panel Blender file. So go to File, Import, AC, and then just navigate to where you have your FG aircraft file and click into it. Click into this, go to Models, Flight Deck, and then the overhead panel should be here. And you want to import that and zoom in a little bit because it's kind of small and then it's kind of angled, so just press the X to just kind of get it flat against our view. Let's zoom in a little bit more using the scroll wheel and then press shift and middle mouse to kind of pan over here, and here it is. Okay, so let's click on it. We can see that it's named knob 0.004. Let's copy this name and let's go into VS Code now and let's look up this knob. We can see that there's 3 results in 2 files. The first file is an AC file, which we just opened, so that makes sense. The second file is the overhead panel.xml file, which is, this is what I coded before making this video. So if we didn't have that, there'd be nothing. So there's no code for this originally, and then when I coded it, here it is and it shows up. So let's kind of step through what I did here. So I couldn't find the air conditioning subpanel section in this file. Could be here, but I just didn't find it. So I kind of made a new section for the air conditioning subpanel. And so this is the flight deck temp dial. Remember that if you watched my last kind of episode, the toggle switch has 2 animations. This is going to be similar in that there's 2 animations. This is the first animation, and then this is the second animation. And the first animation here is going to be associated with, making the dial selectable and adjusting a property in the property tree, and that's about it. And then the second animation is responsible for actually rotating the knob based on a property, and then based on this property, whether it's 0 or 1, we're giving it angles to rotate to. And then we have this axis of rotation to the axis of rotation just kind of, it makes the object rotate around a certain axis, or around a certain point. So let's start with this first little animation here. Remember, this animation is responsible for making the object clickable and adjusting or changing the property in the property tree based on some sort of action. And so start at the beginning, type pick, that makes the entire object selectable. And then, we have to tell FlightGear what object to make selectable. And so that's going to be knob.004, and that's the object name that we got from Blender. And honestly, we can probably just change that to something more logical. We can probably name it flight deck temp. But it's better to have a longer name than a short name. It's better to have a longer and more descriptive name than a shorter and nondescript name. So this is fine. And then remember to, if you're changing names like this, remember to save this Blender file. You don't do save. You do just like how we imported. We have to export this AC file and just navigate back to your FG aircraft, and then navigate back to your overhead panel and overwrite that file. We can copy this name and just kind of replace it. And I think that makes more sense than knob.004. So yeah, that's the object name that we got from Blender. And then we have the actual action of kind of modifying this property here. And so this action is triggered by two buttons, a left click and a forward scroll. Forward scroll, well, a left click in XML is associated with button 0. Forward scroll is associated with button 3. We're making this repeatable, which means if I go into FlightGear, if I click it and hold it down, it's the same thing as clicking it a bunch of times, right? So that's what repeatable means. So if I were to hold down middle mouse click, it'll automatically just kind of rotate counterclockwise. I could scroll as well. So that's what that does. So yeah, when I activate either of these buttons, what happens to this property is that there's a property adjust, and this property is just a new property that I just made up. Since this dial was not animated before, there was no property associated with it. So I had to go into the 787-set.xml file, and I had to make a new folder called air condition, because this is the air conditioning subpanel, and I had to make a new property called the flight deck temp. And so yeah, make sure if you make new properties, or when you reference new properties, you make them in this file and you put them in some sort of logical place, right? You wouldn't put this under lighting or this under gears. You put it in its own little, I would expect the cabin, whenever someone animates this, the property associated with this style to be under like the air conditioning subpanel folder. And if there isn't one, just make one. And if you're confused about what we're even looking at here, this is just, all this file is just a kind of this controls. So look at this. That's a folder in FlightGear controls, and then we have fires, which is another folder. So if we click on controls, we see fires, and then in fires we have fire. let's click on fire, or fires, and then fire. And then within that fire folder, we have the burn time and extinguish, as well as some other properties, which, not all properties are initialized in this folder. Sometimes they're initialized by flag gear itself, and sometimes we can't even see that happening. But yeah, this is what that means. So we have controls slash air condition. So I made a folder. So let's go to controls, and then air condition. It's right here, and it should be there. Look at that. And so when you reference this property, you kind of have to have the property file path, which is control slash air condition, and then the actual variable name. So yeah, when you press this button, it adjusts this property by a step amount until it reaches this maximum value. Now this action is kind of the opposite, and I'll explain why it's the opposite in a second. So we have button 1, which is a middle mouse click, and then button 4, which is backward scroll. Now you might ask, okay, well we have button 0, button 1, 3, and 4. Do we ever use button 2? Button 2 is right click. So I don't think our group will ever use button 2. It's possible, but I've never seen right click be referenced in any shell. But just in case, if you do happen to use it, if you do happen to want to use right click as an input, then it'd be button 2 as right click, right? But we're not. So using just these 3 mainly, or just these 4 mainly for everything. So when you middle click or when you backward scroll, it's going to property adjust this property by a value of negative 0.05 until it reaches a minimum of 0. So when it reaches that minimum of 0, it's not going to step that property any lower than that. Same thing with this. When this property reaches a value of 1, it's not going to increase it further than that. So yeah, that makes sense. When you press these buttons, it increases the property by this. When you press these buttons, it decreases the property by, or I guess modifies the property by this much. So we have that because we have 2 actions here, because we have to define the action of turning the dial clockwise and then turning the dial counterclockwise. So this is counterclockwise, and this is going to be clockwise. And then this is your second animation, which is responsible for actually rotating the dial. So we have rotate. We have the object name here, the object that we're rotating, and then we have the property here that kind of determines which way it's rotating. So when this property is equal to 0, it's going to go towards negative 120, and then when this property is at a value of 1, it's going to go towards 120. Now you might be asking, okay, there's not just 2 states, there's going to be like 20 states because of this, because property could be 0.5 or 0.55 or 0.05. It's hardly ever going to be just 1 or 0. But when you step this by 0.05, it will it will it will rotate the knob by a fraction of the total range. So, okay, so if we go look at this, it's kind of confusing. So this has a minimum of 1 and maximum of minimum of 0, maximum of 1. So if we're stepping through this range by 0.05, then there's what, 20 different states it could be, right? If we divide 1 by 0.05. So if we add the total range of angles, that's going to be a range of 240. So if we have 20 different states, and we have a total range of 240 degrees, then each state, when you step this property, is going to be, what, 12 degrees? So, so when I click on this, it's going to rotate this knob by 12 degrees. So you might be asking, okay, how'd you get 120? Well, most dials in Flight Gear kind of use, let's see, how do I explain this? So if you look at Flight Gear here, Flight Gear and XML kind of considers angle 0 to be the middle. So if we want this dial to reach a minimum of C and a maximum of W, that's going to be about a negative 120. Now that's not going to be exact. You know, we could change it to, we could change that value to 110 to kind of better have this line match up with this line. Just that most dials here kind of use the negative 120 and 120 angle as their min and max. So I just kind of wanted to show you that. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So when you're doing interpolation here for dials, you don't need each individual, you don't need all 20 states, right? Because this value could be, if it has a minimum of 0 and maximum of 1, and you're stepping through that value by 0.05, it could have 20 different states. But you don't need to specify each state in this interpolation part of the animation. You only need the min and max. And then Flight Gear and XML will kind of do the math that kind of says, like, okay, you know, if it's at 0.5, this is equal to 0.5, then logically, you know, the angle should be 0 because 0.5 is the middle of these two states, and the middle of these two states is going to be at an angle of 0, if that makes sense. I encourage you to kind of mess around with this to understand it more. It's not that bad to understand. So let's move on to axis. It's going to be just like the toggle switch. This axis represents the location of the line in which we are rotating this object around. So this line spans from 0 to 1, so it has a length of 1, and it's at the location of this y and z value. Right? So if you imagine this line, it's a straight line spanning from 0 to 1x at these y and z coordinates. Now, if you want to get these coordinates, you would have to go into Blender to the button, or to the switch, and our axis of rotation here for the dial is going to be, we want it to rotate in place. So the axis of rotation would be, it'd be centered in the middle, right? Because if we want to rotate it, we want to rotate it in place around itself. So to view coordinates of this middle, we go, if you look at my mouse, go in the top right, and you can see like this little arrow on the top right next to the axes. And you can either, just click that open. To close it, you can just kind of go to the edge and just kind of drag it. Click and drag, close. But to open it, you just need to click it just once. Go to View. Go to, on the left-hand side of your screen, go to 3D Cursor. And it's over here. And kind of click the middle of the dial. It doesn't have to be exact, but it should be about right. And so this is the location of our axis that which we are placing, and which the dial will rotate around. So the axis will be where the cursor is, cutting through the middle of the dial. And so the location is, since it's on the x-axis, it's going to be rotating around the x-axis. The x is going to change because it's a line. So our y value is 0.26, which is what we have here and here. And then our z value is 0.048. We have 0.0, what do we say? 0.0048. We have 0.0052, which is close enough. So we have 0.0052 here and 0.0052 here. And so for x values, it doesn't matter what we have here. This is just defining an axis. So this could be 0 to 1, or it could be 0 to 5. All that this is saying is that if we gave it, if we have the x's the same, then that would be a point, a singular point in a three-dimensional plane, correct? But if we have those x's different, then now we have a line, right? We're given 2 points. We're given the axis 2 points now, where the y's and z's are the same, but the x's are different. So that's just a line in a three-dimensional plane. That's all that is. That's all this. That's why it's called an axis. We're defining an axis. So hopefully that makes sense. That's going to be it for this video. It's getting pretty long. Next video, I'll be focusing on control knobs. Those are a bit more complicated. And that's it. I'll see you guys next time.